Good morning. Happy Mother's Day. Welcome to the virtual Unitarian Universalist Church of Arlington. I'm Lisa Lerman, a member of the Board of Trustees. We welcome new arrivals, longtime church members, people of all ages, of many backgrounds, and of many beliefs. Today's service will explore how stories and traditions are passed on in families and in communities of friends. My father's family, the Lermans, are descended from one Jewish family that fled Russia in 1912 to avoid genocidal violence. About 50 of us gather every year at Passover for a weekend. Lots of stories get retold, both during the Seder and all weekend. Here's one. In Russia, the Lermans lived in Berdichev near Kiev. They were poor. There was only one warm place to sleep in the house. It was on a ledge above the stove. My great-grandparents had 7 children, so each one got to sleep on the warm ledge once a week. I often try to imagine my grandfather's glee on the nights he got to sleep on the ledge. One of his favorite phrases, joking about scarcity, was, "Sleep faster, I need the pillow." Our family storytelling sparks my curiosity about our history and renews my gratitude for all that those people did to survive and to create a better life. Please join us after the service for our virtual coffee hour, where you can spend a little time getting acquainted with a few others. The link is on our webpage and in the Connections newsletter.
I call us to worship this morning with words of Reverend Scott Taylor. Who dreamed you into being? What stories sat in their heart as they imagined what you would become? Who helped you imagine your story? Who helped you see your place in the story of the world? And as to what matters, who helped you understand that you could be the author of your own unfolding? All of which is a way of asking, who listened? Who listened until you could hear yourself speak, until you trusted the voice that is your own? And what about those stories of others, those stories kept in the cramped spaces of silence, for fear of how hard and narrow this world of ours can be? Who needs your listening so their story can be set free? Whose story needs to be held in your heart so it knows that it is worth entering into the world? We say it is about listening, but it's really about love. It is through affection that our stories are born. They are wooed into this world. They are wooed into this world. Never forget that, nor this, that it is through loving the stories that we discover that they love us back. As we enter into sacred time, I invite you to join me in spirit in lighting our chalice. Perhaps you may wish to light a chalice candle at home so that you too might feel the physical warmth of our presence. We gather together as a community of memory and hope to celebrate life and its infinite possibilities for love. We light this chalice as a symbol of the light within every human heart. May our individual sparks meet and merge, bringing both light and warmth to the world.
Sakura, Sakura, yayoi no sora wa Thank you so much for that beautiful music, Sophia and Kaila. I love that piece, Sakura, so gently inviting us to notice the beauty around us. This is a day for noticing. Many of us may be celebrating Mother's Day today, honoring our own mothers, perhaps missing them or wishing we could be with them. Maybe we are able to connect by phone or Zoom or even in person with our mothers or our children or grandchildren. And maybe that connection is everything we would hope for. Or perhaps it is more complicated, fraught by the realities of mother-child relationships. Perhaps we no longer have a mother living, or perhaps we never had a mother, or perhaps we wish we were a mother, or perhaps we are honoring all the kinds of mothering from all kinds of people that we have received or given. Perhaps in our family, this is non-gender specific Parents' Day number 1, or perhaps we are celebrating both our mothers today. What I want you to know this Mother's Day is that I notice you and all the ways you might be experiencing this day. I notice you. I notice, too, the losses we may be carrying today. The loss that our music and choir community especially are holding as they remember former music director Bob Griffith, who died last week. I notice that grief, and I notice, too, the gratitude that comes with it for the music and community he built at UUCA. Each one of us brings our full hearts to this moment and to every moment, to every encounter. Today, we are honoring the experience of flower communion, a ritual created by Czech Unitarian Dr. Norbert Čapek and brought to the U.S. by his widow, the Reverend Maya Čapek. This ritual invites us to bring ourselves, just as we are, with all our beauty and our brokenness, and to share ourselves as a gift in the form of a flower. In turn, we are invited to notice the beauty of the flowers gathered together, the bouquet created by all our individual selves coming together in community, and then to select a flower to bring home with us, a symbol of the gifts we receive from each other. Last Saturday, and to be together as we are able these days, as we are able, which really is the only way we are ever together, the only way we ever share our gifts, the only way we navigate losses and holidays and holy days. My prayer for you this day is that it is enough. Whatever gift you bring to the world, however your beauty and your brokenness is showing up today, it is enough. Whatever gifts you receive, however they appear in your life, may they be enough. And may we together, all of the gifts gathered in a bouquet, may we know we are enough. I invite you now into the beauty and joy, the gift of our flower communion.
A Springtime Prayer by Major Reverend George Tiger, a UU U.S. Army chaplain. O power of springtime, spirit of green grasses and warm breezes, goddess of creativity, of birth, of life renewed, you sing it all about us at this time. The birds call your sacred name. Buds burst forth your vestment. The sun reaches higher into the sky, shining the light of this new day through the windows of your cathedral, the world. O power of springtime, forgive us our speediness and our racing before your eternal grace, such that we do not see the myriad miracle world that we share. Open our eyes with your warmth and our hearts with your beauty. Slow our minds with awe and wonder. Dear Spirit of green grasses and warm breezes, let us find here in these moments of quiet the grace of your breath as we breathe into our bodies the spirit of spring.
I am so grateful that some of us were able to gather in person to celebrate Flower Communion last weekend, and that those of us who couldn't be there in person are able to experience it through the photographs and the music this morning. Flower Communion is one of my favorite Unitarian Universalist traditions, and I have loved hearing your stories about how it's been celebrated at UUCA in the past, about the procession from the back of the sanctuary where you might bring a flower from home or pick up one provided toward the front of the sanctuary, all generations in line waiting to share their flower and to receive one in return. And I love that you were so willing to be playful and flexible and to try that tradition a little differently this year. Unitarian Universalism, luckily, is like that. It can be flexible and even playful with our traditions. Our rituals can and do change over time, the way they are observed and the meaning that they hold. I often find that there are layers of meaning to a particular tradition based on the years I have observed it. Perhaps seeing a little child, even a toddler, carrying their first flower up to Flower Communion, and then seeing that child graduate from high school ready for their own adventures. UUCA's graduating seniors, in fact, were celebrated in a ceremony for them and their peers and families in the afternoon after flower communion this past Saturday. We sent them home with some of the flowers that were gathered there. It was very cycle of life, and I only saw a tiny sliver of that cycle, but I could see the beauty gathered and the beauty received. And of course, sometimes our traditions change dramatically, or sometimes our tradition's name changes, the wording about that tradition. I discovered that for myself as I was preparing for flower communion. I reached out to some colleagues as part of the preparation and suddenly found myself in what I will call a spirited conversation about whether the words really should be flower communion or flower ceremony, about what Norbert Chopik wanted originally, about what different congregations choose, about whether we get to decide now or whether it matters what happened historically. I ended up receiving one sermon, one partially completed paper prepared originally for publication, and one master's thesis, all about flower communion or flower ceremony. Unfortunately, I already had a sermon topic in mind for this Sunday, but I have saved them all for later reading and perhaps at some point a fuller exploration of the history of this tradition. And honestly, the whole conversation, that spirited conversation, is related to that topic. The idea of stories and names and traditions and how they are passed down. One of the readings that I sometimes use for memorial services comes from the author Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. It's a longer reading, but I'll share just a few pieces from it with you. It's called Generation to Generation. In a house that becomes a home, one hands down and another takes up the heritage of mind and heart. Let us bring up our children. It is not the place of some official to hand to them their heritage. It is needful to transmit the passwords from generation to generation. End quote. To transmit the passwords. Whew! There's a lot packed into that little sentence. But that's right, isn't it? There are passwords or directions or markers along the way that tell us who we are and what is right to do, that tell us what cakes you bake for birthdays and how to behave in front of relatives and how to behave in front of strangers. All the little codes of our lives. Sometimes those passwords, those codes are taught explicitly through family stories or through rules, or if we're lucky, through thoughtful conversations with our elders. Sometimes they are taught implicitly through what we see people doing in our family or in our social groups or cultures. I always think it's interesting when what is taught explicitly is counter to what is taught implicitly. And I will note that we almost always follow the implicit. We know that that is the learned culture, just as powerful, if not more so, even though we cannot always exactly articulate it. It's that learned culture, in fact, that is often the marker of class or of socioeconomic status or of different racial or ethnic heritage or groups. Those passwords that tell us whether we fit in a particular setting or we don't. I have always been interested in how these things are handed down, especially the parts that we aren't told explicitly. In a family or in a community or in a congregation, surely in a congregation. How do we learn the way things are done around here? How do we learn who has authority for certain decisions? and who really has authority for those decisions. That works for families too. You know, the relative that always has to approve the holiday plans, even on the years when they're not going to that holiday. How do we learn the stories that shape identity in a family or in a culture or in a congregation? Maybe the stories that, depending on which way you tell them, show which side of that conflict you were on 2 decades ago, or which side you would choose today. I am particularly interested in the way those stories and conflicts and cultural assumptions get passed down when it's not parent to child or teacher to student, but rather peer to peer to peer to peer on through the generations. So I did a little extremely unscientific research, also known as asking people things on Facebook, to find out about some of that peer-to-peer learning. My theory is that often our first peer-to-peer learning comes through schoolyard games. Things like clapping games, and I particularly asked about the game Miss Mary Mac. Now, some of you are immediately singing a rhyme in your head and maybe even doing the motions along with it. If you're not familiar with Miss Mary Mac, let me give you a quick orientation. It goes like this. Miss, now onto your lap. Mary, Mac, 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 all dressed in black, 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 with silver buttons, buttons, buttons all down her back, back, back. I super hope that some of you were clapping onto the screen so that we had a little moment there. And I will say that when we are back in person and it's safe to either clap hands or maybe at least clap the air in between us, I will play Miss Mary Mac with any of you who would like to. It's my very favorite clapping game. So I asked about Miss Mary Mac and then about schoolyard games like Foursquare with the bouncing red ball or Capture the Flag. Some people talked about learning cops and robbers. Many of the folks on my Facebook feed shared that one now with a cringe, knowing much more about the complicated and dangerous state of policing in the United States. And in my asks, I asked about demographic information for the people responding, especially for Miss Mary Mac, in part because of its history, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. I found that the answers, somewhat to my surprise, were all over the map, literally. People from different parts of the country and in different racial and ethnic groups and of different generations learned Miss Mary Mac, and virtually no one remembered who taught them. I guess it was the kids on the playground. I was homeschooled. Where could I possibly have learned it from? But I did. This begs the question, is clapping Miss Mary Mac an innate experience of humanness? Is it encoded in our DNA? And ditto Capture the Flag, which lots of people played, but no one seems to have actually remembered learning. Of course not. Miss Mary Mac does have a history or several versions of it. Did the rhyme originally refer to the Merrimac, a Union ship that fought Confederate forces during the Civil War, therefore telling a story of freedom and abolition? The ship was black with silver rivets all down its back. If that's the case, is the elephant, a second verse of the rhyme, who jumps over the fence, referring to the original Republican Party, which jumped the fence, i.e. the Mason-Dixon line, to free people who had been enslaved? Or does Miss Mary Mac refer to the late 1800s slang word for flirting, giving it a much seedier history? Or how about it referring to the person, Miss Mary Mac, a passenger who went down with the Titanic? We don't know exactly the history, or at least I couldn't find it in my research. What we do know, or at least one internet source thinks we know, is that Miss Mary Mac became a popular clapping game within Black communities in the United States in the early 1920s. And what I know, based on my Facebook threads, is that it was taught child to child to child almost entirely among children socialized as girls, across demographics and generations and in different parts of the country. In the last, I would say I covered at least back 70 years in those threads. I learned it as a child, I don't know from whom, and my children learned it, and not from me. So what fascinates me here is the transmission of material, of passwords, language, and story across generations and across demographics. The expansion of whose game this is, who taught it to whom, and when did it jump fences, and the many versions of what it might mean. Luckily, all the potential histories that I found of Miss Mary Mack were either relatively benign or actually pro-abolition, which is not always the case when we begin to learn the stories behind the stories. Some of you may be familiar with the racist origins of many children's nursery rhymes and counting and clapping games, or the stories behind our family's stories. Stories of our relatives that are only whispered, or behind our congregational stories. I was in a conversation with the Reverend Nancy MacDonald Ladd, who serves as senior minister at River Road Unitarian Universalist Congregation in Bethesda, our sibling congregation just over the Potomac. River Road recently engaged in a multi-year study, thanks in part to a public social historian, I think I've got that right, who's a member of the congregation, looking at the history of the land that River Road UU congregation is built on. What they found is that this piece of land, which when River Road bought it many years ago, was sort of the largest contiguous piece of land along River Road, was one parcel of land because it had belonged to the same family for many years, beginning as a plantation. This land, purchased because it was kept whole and large, was only that because of the history of enslaved people. The history of enslaved people right on the land where a Unitarian Universalist congregation came to be. River Road is just learning this history, this story behind the story, and they are only at the beginning of understanding what it means for their present and for their future to know the story now. It is, I believe, important to know our family stories, whether our actual family or the family systems that we create in our congregations and communities, in part because the rhythm gets into our culture. We find the subtext, the culture of these stories repeats generation after generation, taught by no one knows who. Sometimes you can trace those repeats. Maybe the characters have changed, but the basic conflicts stay the same. I suspect those of you who have been part of UUCA for a long time could do that. Or any of you, as you think about your family and the way that things repeat time after time. The program areas maybe, or the particular holidays that are always a source of tension. No one really knows why, no matter how carefully they are approached. Sometimes that's because the story hasn't been told fully yet. The rhythm has been passed along, but the work of understanding, the work of learning the words and the history is still ongoing. My favorite low-key example of this comes in the story of let's say it's a Christmas roast. In this particular family, the story goes, they cut each end off the roast before putting it in the oven every year. Well, that's how their parents taught them to do it. One year they start wondering why that is. Does it make the roast juicier? Does it taste better? So they ask the parents, and the parents say, well, I don't know. That's how my parents taught me how to do it. And so they go back and finally discover that the grandmother who started making this roast every Christmas cut the ends off because she had a 3/4 size oven and it only fit in that way. The cut off ends of the roast didn't make it juicier or better, but it did tell a story about the family. And now they understood the why. And that's true in congregations too. It's important for us to know the stories behind the stories. In your interim time over the last 2 years, you all did a lot of that learning as a congregation, but I suspect there are still stories whose full history is unfolding, is getting extra sunlight these days, just as there are in families or in countries. Many of us in the United States, and particularly those of us who were socialized and identify as white, are learning stories about the history of our country that have been hidden or covered up. I believe that rooting out those stories, telling them fully and honestly to ourselves and to each other, is a way to move forward. And that is true in congregational life. Telling the stories behind the stories as fully as we can, with all the sides and all the versions, the different emotions that we might still be holding, so that we can look at the rhythm, the bouncing ball, the clapping hands, the rhythm of congregational life. It helps us understand how we got that rhythm and to make choices about whether we want to keep it just as it is or choose new rhythms, new ways to play the game, to add into who we are together, how we are together. And so we know what to teach each other, what to teach our children and our youth. So we know how to say out loud what the rules are, the expectations of being part of a community, the joyful obligations, the ways we show care and love to each other, the ways we support each other's boundaries by honoring the no as well as the yes. Imagine learning to say out loud all the passwords so that every new person, everyone who finds us, can learn who we have been and who we are now and who we seek to be, and can co-create it with we who have been here and we who have yet to arrive. Imagine doing that in this congregation or in your family or in this country or the world that we share. Imagine telling our stories out loud, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the fullness of the stories behind the stories, so that together we can write new ones. So together we can understand the rhythm and make choices about how to keep playing together. And then imagine passing it on.
70% of our offerings made today and any day through May 22nd go to our Share the Plate partner, AFAC. That is the Arlington Food Assistance Center, who it's been operating since 1988, and it's doing wonderful service in obtaining and distributing food to our Arlington neighbors who are most in need. This is particularly true, of course, during this time of COVID. Throughout that history, UUCA has been active in volunteering. Turning today, these people here are working with us. And Pat, introduce yourselves and please tell us why you work with AFAC.
Hi, I'm Pat.
And I'm Ken.
And I'm Burke.
And I'm Max.
Our family discovered AFAC in 2001 when we first joined UUCA. Daniel's 4th grade RE class had a community service action that we performed at AFAC. Ken and I went as helpers, and we bagged potatoes and scrubbed the refrigerator. Well, 20 years later, we're still there. Volunteer hours are so important to AFAC. Right now, the food insecurity needs, because of, in good part of the COVID, have increased by 45% in Arlington. We are feeding 45% more clients than they were before the COVID. That's between 2,200 and 2,300 families per week. Volunteers are so important. Last year, 50,000 volunteer hours allowed AFAC to put $1 million more into the programs to distribute additional food to our neighbors instead of having to pay those hours of staffing. I hope that you will help us. We go often to AFAC to do many things, and please check connections for the next opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. And certainly look to connections for ways to give. There are many. You can write a check payable to UUCA, you can use text, you can use the app Give Plus, you can go to the church website, but read your connections article for the details. But please, let's dedicate our offering. Let us be grateful when we are able to give, for many do not have that privilege. Let us be grateful for those who share their gifts with us, for we are enriched by their giving. Let us be grateful even for our needs, so that we may learn from the generosity of others. And so we commit our offering, and so we commit ourselves.
From you I receive, to you I give, together we share, and from this we live. From you I receive, to you
From you I receive, to you I give. The flowers, the stories, the fullness of who we are. May you both give and receive this week. May we learn to tell the story behind the story, and may we learn to pass it on.